Have you ever wondered why the world's reigning superpower always seems to lean on rising challengers? This isn't new. When the United States eclipsed Britain at the turn of the 20th century, London tried to close off markets and protect its empire. When Japan rose in the 1930s, Washington responded with embargoes and military posturing. Today, the same dynamic is playing out with China. The United States accuses Beijing of cheating, subsidies, and unfair trade. Chinese officials counter that Washington is trying to keep them down. In the words of Singaporean scholar and diplomat Kishore Mahbubani, whenever the world's number one emerging power is about to overtake the world's number one power, the number one power always pushes down the number one emerging power. It is an age-old pattern. But here's the twist. Most countries in Asia do not see China as a threat. In fact, surveys and statements from regional leaders show that ASEAN nations value their ties with both Washington and Beijing. Mahbubani notes that Southeast Asia's 680 million people want to be friends with both the United States and China. Former Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has repeatedly urged the West to accept China as a risen power rather than a perpetual threat. For them, the real danger is being forced to pick a side. So why are we talking about poison pills in trade deals? Less than a week after President Donald Trump met China's President Xi Jinping and called him a friend, the Financial Times broke a story that shook Kuala Lumpur and Phnom Penh. It revealed that the US trade agreements signed with Malaysia and Cambodia during Trump's Southeast Asian tour contained a clause allowing Washington to suspend or terminate benefits if the partner deepens trade ties with any third country that the United States deems a security risk. Who might that be, you ask? The agreement doesn't name China explicitly, but everyone knows who the third country is. It's a loyalty test built into a trade agreement. What exactly is a poison pill clause? In corporate finance, a poison pill is a defensive measure that makes a takeover prohibitively expensive. In these new trade pacts, the term takes on a geopolitical meaning. Benefits are offered to a partner country on the condition that it does not sign trade agreements with certain other countries. Under the October 2025 US-Malaysia and US-Cambodia reciprocal trade agreements, Washington may suspend or terminate tariff relief if the partner concludes any free trade agreement or comprehensive economic cooperation agreement with a third country or customs territory that the United States believes jeopardizes the essential security interests of the United States or poses a material threat to US national security. Notice the vagueness. Essential interests and material threat are undefined and thus subject to Washington's unilateral interpretation. There is no requirement to consult the partner before pulling the plug and no limitation to specific countries. These provisions go far beyond earlier U.S. trade language. Article 32.10 of the USMCA allows a party to withdraw if another party negotiates a free trade agreement with a non-market country, widely understood to mean China. However, the USMCA clause includes procedural safeguards. It requires at least 3 months' notice and a 30-day consultation period and only allows termination of the withdrawing party's obligations to the other two partners. The new Malaysia and Cambodia agreements drop those limits. They grant Washington broad power to decide what constitutes a threat and to suspend benefits without any mutually agreed process. Malaysia and Cambodia deals with strings attached. On the surface, the Malaysia and Cambodia deals were sold as routine trade agreements. Malaysia would slash tariffs on a range of US goods and ease regulations on imported US livestock, cosmetics, and spirits. In return, the United States would maintain its reciprocal tariff rate on Malaysian goods at 19% and carve out a short list of products, such as certain electronic components and minerals, that can enter the US duty-free. Malaysia also promised to invest $70 billion in the United States over the next decade, buy Boeing aircraft and semiconductors, and refrain from banning or restricting exports of critical minerals and rare earths. Cambodia's deal similarly kept US tariffs at 19% while offering duty-free access for some textiles and farm products. In exchange, Cambodia would purchase US farm equipment and participate in supply chain enforcement. But buried deep in the implementing provisions lies the poison pill. If either country signs a trade deal or deeper economic cooperation agreement with a third party that Washington deems risky, the United States may revoke the tariff relief and revert to the high reciprocal rates, 24% for Malaysia. In other words, the US can unilaterally decide whether a Malaysian or Cambodian partnership with China constitutes a threat, and if so, punish them economically. That's why analysts call these clauses loyalty tests disguised as trade policy. They convert market access into an instrument of political alignment. Malaysia's government defended the deal. Investment, Trade and Industry Minister Tengku Zafrul Aziz called the agreement the best possible outcome for a small, open economy that needs access to both US and Chinese markets. Critics disagreed. Former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad said the clause amounts to modern-day imperialism, a forced submission of Malaysia's independent foreign policy to US strategic interests. We agreed to buy their airplanes, gas and machines. We agreed that they have the first bite of the cherry of our rare minerals. And now we must check with them before doing business with anyone else? For him, the cost of compliance is national sovereignty. The UK Economic Prosperity Deal, a precedent. If this feels like a new development, it isn't. In May 2025, the US signed an economic prosperity deal with the United Kingdom. That agreement offered limited tariff relief, allowing Britain to sell up to 100,000 cars into the US at a 10% tariff and granting quotas at most favored nation rates for steel and aluminium. In return, British companies had to comply with strict US national security conditions on supply chain transparency and ownership, particularly in steel and pharmaceuticals. Chinese commentators describe these clauses as poison pills worse than tariffs because they require Britain to screen out Chinese investors and suppliers. The deal effectively gives Washington a veto over which companies can participate in British exports. British officials downplayed the sovereignty concerns, stressing that the US was simply ensuring that sensitive sectors remain under friendly control. But the precedent was set, market access tied to political allegiance. Beijing's reaction was blunt. China's foreign ministry warned that the UK-US deal would force Britain to exclude Chinese products from its supply chains, undermining free trade and harming third parties. Reports noted that Chinese researchers called the agreement's national security clauses poison pills worse than tariffs. In other words, the world's second largest economy saw the US attempt to cut it out of supply chains through a trade deal with a third country as a direct threat. Why the United States is rewriting trade rules. Understanding the poison pill strategy requires a look at the changing balance of global manufacturing. In the late 1940s, the United States produced more than 60% of the world's manufactured goods. War-ravaged Europe and Japan depended on US machines, cars, chemicals, and food. Washington wrote the rules of post-war trade, first through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and later through the World Trade Organization, to open markets, reduce tariffs, and spread American products. In that environment, free trade worked wonders for US industry. But those days are gone. As Europe, Japan, and later South Korea industrialized, America's share of global manufacturing fell from around 50% in 1950 to 25% by 1980 and has since slipped to less than 15%. Meanwhile, China has risen from under 10% in 2000 to more than 35% today, becoming the world's largest manufacturing powerhouse. China now dominates production of key technologies: electric vehicle batteries, solar panels, and drones. It accounts for around 60% of global steel output and more than 90% of processed rare earth elements. In short, the rules of free trade no longer work in Washington's favor. From the US perspective, China's rise is due in part to what Washington sees as unfair practices, industrial subsidies, intellectual property theft, and state-supported overcapacity. The US also argues that Chinese domination of critical minerals and supply chains poses national security risks. Hence the shift. Rather than simply raising tariffs, the US is embedding strategic conditionality into trade law. If allies and partners want access to the massive US market, they must align with US policies on supply chain security, investment screening, and export controls. As one analyst explains, the Malaysia and Cambodia clauses serve as loyalty tests designed to limit China's ability to use its own agreements to draw countries away from Washington's orbit. How do these clauses work? Let's read the fine print. Consider Article 17 of the US-Malaysia Agreement. It states that if Malaysia signs an economic cooperation agreement with a third country and the United States determines that this agreement poses a material threat to US national security, Washington may suspend the Malaysian tariff concessions. There is no specification of what evidence is required, no requirement to consult Malaysia, and no obligation to give a reason. The termination is immediate. Malaysia would revert to the 24% reciprocal tariff rate, losing its preferential access. Similarly, the US-Cambodia deal allows termination if Cambodia concludes a free trade agreement with a country that threatens US essential interests. These clauses are broad enough to cover virtually any deal with China. They could be triggered if Malaysia deepens its involvement in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or upgrades its free trade agreement with China. They could even apply if Cambodia accepts Chinese investment in critical infrastructure. The ambiguity of the triggers is intentional. It creates chilling effects. Malaysian and Cambodian officials must now consider US political preferences before signing any major economic agreement with Beijing. By contrast, the USMCA's Article 32.10 narrowly defines non-market country and provides explicit procedures for consultations and withdrawal. It only applies to future free trade agreements and allows the other parties to continue trading with each other. In other words, Canada and Mexico can still trade with each other even if one of them signs a deal with China. The Malaysia and Cambodia poison pills are far more aggressive because they allow the United States to terminate both parties' benefits unilaterally. Why Southeast Asia feels the squeeze? Most Southeast Asian countries have no desire to decouple from China. China has been Malaysia's largest trading partner for 15 consecutive years. Malaysia's electrical and electronics sector is deeply integrated into Chinese supply chains. Roughly 60% of Malaysia's electrical and electronic exports feed into Chinese or China-linked production chains. According to a 2018 study by economist Martin Kaur, Malaysia's exports are 60% dependent on global supply chains, compared with 48% for China and 40% for the United States. Many Malaysian chip components are assembled in China or Hong Kong before being re-exported. Similarly, Cambodia is heavily reliant on Chinese investment, infrastructure financing, and markets. The country hosts Chinese industrial parks and factories producing garments, electronics, and agricultural goods. Cambodia is a key participant in China's Belt and Road Initiative. At the same time, both Malaysia and Cambodia value their ties with the United States. Malaysia is the sixth largest semiconductor exporter to the US and hosts multinational chip assembly and testing operations. Cambodia exports garments and footwear to US retailers. Southeast Asia's balancing act has long been described as hedging, cultivating close trade ties with China while maintaining security and investment relationships with the US. Leaders like Mahbubani and Lee Hsien Loong stress that ASEAN must not be forced to choose between great powers. The poison pill clauses threaten to end that hedging space. They effectively tell Malaysia and Cambodia, if you deepen economic ties with China, we will punish you with tariffs. What happens when hedging is no longer an option? Reaction and backlash. The reaction across Southeast Asia has been swift. In Malaysia, opposition parties and civil society groups accuse the government of signing away sovereignty. Former Prime Minister Mahathir said the deal forces Malaysia to surrender our independence and side with US strategic priorities. The government responded by releasing a detailed FAQ explaining that the clause merely requires consultation, not automatic sanctions, and insisted that Malaysia can still pursue an FTA with China if it consults Washington first. Yet the fact that such consultations are necessary underscores the loss of autonomy. Cambodia's government has been more circumspect, avoiding public criticism while quietly worrying about the clause's implications. The ruling Cambodian People's Party relies on Chinese infrastructure investment and trade preferences. Losing either would be economically devastating. Cambodian officials have hinted that they hope Washington never invokes the clause, but the mere existence of the provision increases uncertainty for investors and planners. China, unsurprisingly, condemned the poison pill approach. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokespersons said the US was trying to hijack Southeast Asia's supply chains and economic policies. Chinese state media argued that the clause turns trade deals into instruments of coercion and compared it to 21st century piracy, seizing leverage over other countries' economic choices. Beijing responded by accelerating the upgrade of the China-ASEAN Free Trade Area, which promises deeper tariff cuts, digital trade cooperation, and infrastructure financing with no strings attached. Days after the US-Malaysia and US-Cambodia deals were announced, ASEAN and China formally signed an upgrade protocol emphasizing their commitment to free trade without conditions. Europe's example, a warning from across the globe. While Southeast Asia grappled with poison pills, Europe learned its own lesson about weaponizing trade. In late 2025, the Dutch government moved to seize control of Nexperia, a chipmaker owned by China's Wingtech, citing US export control concerns. Beijing retaliated by restricting exports of Nexperia's packaged chips from China. The European Automobile Manufacturers Association and the US Alliance for Automotive Innovation warned that global car production could be disrupted because Nexperia packages billions of basic chips used in vehicle electronics. Honda had to adjust production in North America, and US auto plants faced potential shutdowns. The episode showed how quickly supply chains can become collateral damage when governments politicize corporate ownership. It also revealed the complexity of decoupling from Chinese manufacturing. Even basic diodes and transistors can become choke points. Beyond tariffs, rare earths and strategic minerals. An important element of the Malaysia and Cambodia deals is the Critical Minerals Pledge. Malaysia agreed not to ban or restrict exports of rare earths and other minerals to the United States. This clause was added after China tightened its own export controls on certain heavy, rare earth elements. In October 2025, Beijing expanded its export control list to include holmium, erbium, thulium, europium, and ytterbium and required foreign companies using Chinese materials to obtain export licenses. China produces over 90% of refined rare earths and magnets, so its controls can severely disrupt global supply chains. The US responded by courting alternative suppliers, Malaysia, Vietnam, Australia, and by embedding assurances in trade deals that partners will not follow China in restricting exports. For Malaysia, the commitment not to restrict critical minerals exports may seem benign. Yet, combined with the poison pill clause, it locks Malaysia into the US supply chain strategy. If China offers Malaysia financing for a rare earth project, can Malaysia accept? Or would that be seen as deepening ties with a threat and risk suspension? These questions illustrate how trade policy is becoming a tool of geoeconomic competition. The view from ASEAN: don't make us choose. Asian leaders have been clear, they don't want to choose. Mahbubani warns that if forced to pick sides, Southeast Asian countries will likely choose China because of geography and economic integration. ASEAN economies depend on Chinese tourists, investors, and supply chains. At the same time, they value US investment, technology, and security guarantees. The region's prosperity over the past 2 decades has been built on being a bridge between the two giants. When Washington inserts loyalty tests into trade deals, it risks undermining that bridge. It signals to ASEAN partners that the US sees them not as equal economic partners, but as pieces on a geopolitical chessboard. The message is, access to our market comes with strings attached, alignment is mandatory. For countries that cherish their strategic autonomy, this is deeply uncomfortable. Could this backfire on Washington? There are reasons to doubt whether poison pill clauses will achieve their intended effect. First, the clauses may simply drive ASEAN states to diversify even further toward China and other partners. If the cost of siding with the US is the loss of autonomy, some governments may decide it isn't worth it. Beijing is already offering deeper integration through its upgraded free trade area with ASEAN and through initiatives like the Belt and Road. Vietnam, Thailand, and other countries might decide to prioritize RCEP and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership over US agreements. Second, enforcement could prove politically costly for Washington. Imagine the US actually terminating Malaysia's tariff privileges because Kuala Lumpur signs a pact with China. The backlash from Malaysian public opinion and from other ASEAN members watching closely could damage US influence in the region. The ambiguity of the clause means Washington might hesitate to pull the trigger, fearing diplomatic fallout. A clause that is never enforced may deter some agreements at the margin, but it might also breed resentment. Third, by turning trade deals into loyalty pledges, the US risks undermining the very multilateral system it built after World War II. The WTO's rules prohibit tying market access to political conditions. If every great power started copying this model, conditioning market access on alignment, the global trading system could fracture. Already, Europe is enacting carbon border taxes, China is imposing its own export controls, the United States is rewriting rules for supply chains. We may be witnessing the end of the liberal economic order and the dawn of geoeconomic blocs. The bigger picture: manufacturing, power, and legitimacy. Why resort to poison pills? One answer lies in the erosion of US manufacturing dominance. In the immediate post-war era, America's factories churned out half the world's goods. Tariff reductions and free trade served US interests because they opened foreign markets to American exports. As Europe, Japan, and China industrialized, the US share shrank. Today, China produces more than a third of the world's manufacturing output. It dominates batteries, drones, and 5G equipment. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, the United States is no longer the unchallenged manufacturing leader. This shift undermines the legitimacy of the free trade rules the US wrote. Another answer is domestic politics. Protectionism has bipartisan support in Washington. Voters in manufacturing states blame trade for factory closures and job losses. Politicians respond by promising tough stances on China and pledging to bring production home. Loyalty tests in trade agreements allow them to claim they are protecting American workers while punishing cheaters. The problem is that economic interdependence runs deep. US companies rely on Chinese suppliers for chips, rare earths, and consumer goods. Breaking those ties abruptly could cause massive disruption, as Europe's Nexperia episode showed. Finally, there is the strategic competition. The United States views advanced technologies, AI, semiconductors, quantum computing, as decisive for military and economic power. It fears that China's access to Western capital and technology will enable Beijing to dominate these sectors. Thus, it seeks to build a technology alliance excluding China, sometimes called friend-shoring or ally-shoring. Poison pill clauses are one instrument in this strategy. They aim to keep partners inside the US technology ecosystem and outside China's. Whether this will work remains to be seen. Where do we go from here? So, what might the future look like? Expect similar clauses in upcoming US agreements with Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Expect more regional backlash and debate about sovereignty. Expect China to counter by offering trade deals with fewer conditions, inviting Southeast Asian nations to integrate even more deeply into its supply chains. Will countries like Malaysia and Cambodia accept being junior partners in a US-led bloc? Or will they seek alternative paths with China, the EU, and other emerging powers? Will Washington actually enforce the poison pills, or will they remain symbolic deterrents? And perhaps most importantly, is the era of open, non-discriminatory trade over? These questions will shape the next decade of global politics and economics. For now, one thing is clear. Trade policy has become a battleground for geopolitics. the United States is rewriting the rules to ensure that market access comes with political allegiance. Southeast Asia, long a beneficiary of globalization, is being told to choose sides. As viewers and citizens, we should ask ourselves, do we want a world of rigid blocs, or a world where countries can engage with multiple partners on their own terms? The answer will determine not just who trades with whom, but who thrives in the 21st century economy. Trade will no longer be just about tariffs, it will be about alliances. For Southeast Asia, the poison pill is not just in the contract, it's in the geopolitical game. And for America and China, the question is no longer whether they will decouple, but how much the rest of the world will be forced to decouple along with them. Think about that the next time you read about a seemingly routine trade agreement. It may be much more than meets the eye.